So while Sean's pulling these up, you know, we're going to talk about the stuff that may not be as fun for you, but you know, it's really critical if you're going to do this at any kind of big scale. So can you go out and build these structures in a pilot project anywhere and probably have some benefit? Yes, you can. And I would encourage you to do that just to build your confidence, to see what it's all about. But if you're going to take this and scale it up over a big area and hoping to have some real measurable outcomes, then, you know, 80% of the benefit or more that you're going to get out of that project comes from picking the right places to work. And so we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about that. Next. So as Sean and I travel around with different partners and we say, you know, let's go take a look at opportunities to address channel incision. This is where we usually get taken, right? This is a very common site. It's the first place we go, and we walk out and we stand on the edge of this cliff hoping not to fall in, and they say, well, what should we do here? And I kind of joke, I say, give it a name, because this is a new feature on your landscape, right? This is the obvious stuff that we're all used to. In fact, most of like our producers that we work with, you know, this will be where we'll go first, because they'll say, I've been looking at this eyesore for 50 years. You know, unfortunately, this is pretty far gone, and we're down to the stage where, you know, you're building a new inset floodplain down there at the bottom, which has benefits as well. But what we want to do is maybe zoom out a little bit and say, what are the other opportunities that aren't as obvious? So next slide. And we can use a medical analogy here. We're all familiar with, you know, preventative care versus ending up in the emergency room, right? If we go to the doctor regularly and we do our tests and we act on things early before they're a real problem, it's much more likely to be effective, less expensive, and something that we'd prefer to do rather than end up, you know, in the emergency room, which can be costly and may or may not even work. And so this is a concept that our NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife team has kind of put into this cartoon, because we use the same thought process across all of the different resource issues that we're addressing on rangelands. And you can put this into a spatial context. And by that, I mean like on a map where intact areas tend to be near one another. And you know, they are affected by degradation further down the watershed or upslope in surrounding areas. And so we can actually use this information to create a plan for embedding ourselves in and around these cores where we can still have opportunities to address early resource concerns and be more effective at it. Next. So for our Meadow work, what we're talking about is finding these early opportunities to intervene. Stuff that may not seem like a big deal yet is the perfect kind of site to work in. And even areas that are pretty good often have small signatures of early degradation that we could get on now and really kind of, for a little bit of effort, achieve a lot of long-term benefit. That's not to say we would never work or don't ever work in more highly degraded areas. This is about where would you choose to spend your first dollar if you have a choice. Next. And because we're working lands for wildlife, we're trying to find that balance between sustainable ranching and wildlife values. You know, we see the greatest outcomes from this kind of work when we bring in that landscape core concept. You know, where are those intact places that are vulnerable, with information on our wildlife strongholds, which areas are important for deer, grouse, fish, whatever. And then we combine the cultural will, right? What is that community's willingness and interest in doing this work, right? In a voluntary fashion. And so where we overlap those three things, that's the sweet spot where big things can happen. Next. And so as you're thinking about this in your particular work area, I would encourage you to kind of think about the data, think about the local knowledge, think about the information that's available to you to start to narrow down the realm of possibility. And you can use GIS information on landscape condition. Your wildlife folks will have information on priority habitats, seasonal habitats of interest. And then of course your boots on the ground, your landowners and your community partners will know, what's feasible, who's ready, where the resources located to get her done. And so Sean is now going to share with us some applications of this from his experience in the Gunnison Basin of Colorado. So Sean, I'll kick it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, this project, it's kind of a mouthful here, as you can read it on the screen. But this came out of a climate adaptation idea in the Gunnison Basin. We have a grouse there called the Gunnison sage grouse. It's a smaller version of the ones you guys are familiar with there in Wyoming. This is a separate species. It is a threatened species now. There's probably about 4,000 to 5,000 birds left around the population in Gunnison and some smaller areas in western Colorado and in eastern Utah. And so they have a working group there in Gunnison. A bunch of people came together, try and figure out what could be done. And basically, when we think about this idea, where should we work? Which is a really important one when you start a project like this. It's important to get with your partners and really articulate what are your goals and objectives for a project like this. And go beyond sort of this idea about, well, we just want to stop erosion or stop head cuts, and really focus on, what are the desired outcomes and benefits from the work that you're doing. And as I said, in Gunnison, we were, working with this bird that really relies on these wet meadow systems late in their brood rearing time, when they can bring their chicks into these areas when all the uplands here have dried out. It's all hot and dusty and dry, and they come down to these wet areas for the insects to really bolster their chick survival. And as Mark showed early on, these wet green emerald ribbons in sagebrush become really critical. And not really just for grouse or deer and elk, but also, for people that are making their living off the land, like ranchers, and cows need this type of stuff as well, especially late in the season when everything's dried out. And so really the goal that we articulated in Gunnison was to build resiliency into these habitats to help both wildlife and ranchers adapt to a varying climate now. So as Jeremy said, there's no lack of degraded systems across the West that need help. And we do get tied into these, or attracted to these big, huge, nasty gullies. We point at them, they hurt, they make our hearts hurt, and we feel like, what can we do here? But resources are really limited. And so trying to come up with an idea about how to prioritize where to start the work can be important. And this is a generalization. This is some work that came out of the Nature Conservancy of Colorado in Gunnison. There was some spatial work that was done, remote GIS analysis, to help us narrow down where in this big basin really should we be starting. And we can get into further detail later. I can provide you some information from Teresa Chapman, who did this work. But she developed some analysis, some modelings about restoration potential based on NDVI analysis, overlaid it with a number of different attributes, such as leks and buffers of leks, since we know that the grouse typically nest fairly close to where they have attended leks. And she came up with priority reach maps, reaches that had high priority from a number of different factors, but a lot of our work was based on sage grouse. And so her product then became priority restoration sites on a map. And I guess, I think just briefly really here, in our day and age, we rely a lot on sitting at our desks with computers telling us about the world. And I just want to say that while models and GIS work can be extremely valuable, I'm a huge fan of going to the field then and actually looking at stuff on the ground and validating what the model has told you. And so that's a really important part then. It's great to have this narrowed down approach, but you then need to go to the field with your project partners. We have a hydrologist here, we have an ecologist here, and we're looking at a specific site here. And so visiting each of your potential areas is the next step to really evaluate what's going on the ground and narrow that list down so you can try and prioritize. So when you do your field assessment, we go back to this reading the landscape idea, looking at landform, looking at what the impairments might be. This is a little 2-foot head cut. This one's about 4-foot head cut. The valley bottom width here is pretty wide. You've got a lot of potential area here to maybe work with. This one here is fairly narrow, this little reach, little pocket meadow above this head cut right here, not as much. And so this evaluation really about restoration potential and reading the landscapes are things that you have to assess. Some other factors to consider is, what is the sediment supply? You can see this is a one rock dam. It's got a lot of sediment built up behind it. If you have a lot of sediment, typically you can get a lot more restoration potential response quickly. What's your water supply? Again, reading the landscape. Is it a perennial flow? Is it spring fed? How much water do you have? Typically areas with water that you can work with, if you have water coming down the channel, maybe your restoration efforts can happen quicker. If you're waiting in an ephemeral channel for that one big storm, it's typically coming more often than not these days, but where the water's coming from and how much is an important factor when you're deciding where should we work. And of course, feasibility and costs. How much money do you have? How hard is it going to get there? Those are all factors. So again, going back to the importance of the reach that you're looking at to your project goals, we were looking at this bird. Do Gunnison sage grouse really use the area? Is it an important spot for late brood rearing? Can we show that? How, and this is site specific stuff, whatever your particular goals are for your project, when you're out in the field, does that reach meet those goals? And then talking about land ownership, I talked about this a little bit, both sides of the fence here. We talked that streams and water doesn't really honor ownership boundaries. And so the most successful riparian restoration projects are ones that work across these fence lines, and if you've got some private land, working down onto some BLM, trying to work with both those managers and neighbors is a really good approach. One really big one, when you're doing your field assessment, can you get any materials there? That's, there's a lot of remote reaches that you may not be able to find any wood. You may not be able to find any rocks on site. So can you get to where you want to work with your materials is another important factor when you're discussing where should we work. And finally, this idea that Jeremy brought up, we always want to come to these big old eroded spots. And one of Bill's statements that he tries to hammer home is really do the easy stuff first. Start with that low-hanging fruit. This may not look like a bunch, but you can do a little bit of work here and a few hours work and preserve this whole meadow. This is the easy stuff. So concentrate on the low risk, easy stuff first as maybe one of your primary things to think about when you're deciding where to work. All right. And with that, I'll hand it back to Brian here, and then we'll get ready for our next one.
All right. Thank you. We don't have a break now or a question session. So yeah, if you just want to roll right into project implementation stuff, Sean, that would be great. And this is going to be where Sean gets really excited. He lots of rock pictures. This guy is a rock aficionado like no other. I'm certain his significant other wishes he was into gems as much as he's into rocks. But
Yes, that's absolutely right. She does get tired of me talking about rocks, especially when we're driving down the road, looking at road cuts. But rock is one of the main factors. Let's talk a little bit about project implementation. You know, how to start one of these projects. So the first step really, you know, is the design. And all of this work goes back to reading the landscape. This idea right here about walking the reach multiple times is one of Bill's signature thoughts. He really feels like you need to walk a particular reach 3, 4, 5 times before you can really start to understand what's going on. What are you seeing? Why are you seeing what you're seeing? And in fact, he's a big creative thinker and believes that you should actually go away, you know, and come back to the spot. Because if you just come back the same day or the day after, you just come up with the same ideas that you had the day before. And so thinking about, you know, walking the reach, being open-minded, trying to understand what's going on with the hydrology, what's going on with the geomorphology, what ecology interactions are you seeing that might be having an effect? All that stuff feeds into this idea about what should you be doing and what kind of treatments might you use. So we're always remembering the goals, head cut control, grade control, and restoring sheet flow to these systems really helps you understand which structures and which treatments might work where. One thing I want to point out, and this is true for all low-tech type restoration structures or treatments, is this idea about a complex. It's not just one structure in a reach that does everything. It's a complex of structures. It's all these structures working together in unison to really try and effectively restore an entire reach. So this map here is just a little example. We also have the green is Forest Service, this is private, and this is BLM down here. And so we were able to work across those fence lines, treat this entire reach, but really thinking of a variety of different structure types in each of these individual locations, working together in concert. Similar to this, you know, this is a staging map. All these yellow dots are treatment areas, are treatments. So this idea about cascading effects, that it's not just these low-tech restoration structures, it's not just one structure, it's a bunch of structures all working together. And so, for example, when Jeremy said earlier, you know, if one structure blows out, it's not really that big of a deal because you've got a whole complex working together in this low-risk type environment to implement your layout and design of this restoration practice. So layout and staking, once you have an idea of what you'd like to do, you know, the next step would then be to stake structures and identify the dimensions so you can calculate material needed. This stake here is just a little example of how we typically stake our structures. Now, this isn't this isn't a hard and fast rule, but we do have a system so everybody understands from the project what we're up to. And so this would be this circled number up here would be structure number. So this is structure number 45. And then we have the structure type, which is this is short for one rock dam, an ORD. It's typically what we say. So you can see here we got Zuni Bowl, ORD. That's pretty much it there. And then you have the dimensions. So the structure dimensions, 4 by 8 by 1. And these are all in feet, I guess, because we're Americans here. But 4 is the dimension up and down the channel. The next one is 8, which is the dimension across the channel. And then 1 is the height of the channel, or of the structure, excuse me. So 4 by 8 by 1 is what this one rock dam was envisioned to be in this particular location. And what we do then is, we record it with the GPS, and we take these data and we can multiply all this stuff together. We divide it by 27, which gives us cubic yards. So basically the idea is to try and come up with a total quantity of material needed to implement your treatments. So some of the fun stuff about project implementation, of course, is, working around water. Typically across the country, there's some sort of permitting or consultation that's generally needed. I would say it varies highly, but some of the stuff that you may have to run into, is of course your NEPA work. If you're working on federal projects, Corps of Engineers, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. If you're working around or within or with endangered species, you may have to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Cultural resource concerns, really common one. And I think one of the things that Jeremy and I have learned by traveling to different states doing this work is really that state regulations really vary from one state to the next. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this in a little bit later with Ben about Wyoming. I guess some of the stuff that I've learned from our work in Gunnison, a lot of this stuff in Colorado was brand new. Our regulators had no idea what we were talking about. And so we engaged with them early and often. And I think that's maybe the best recommendation that I can give in this regard with working with your regulators. And it's about, we had them out to our project sites, tried to explain what we were doing, why we thought it was a good idea. And so that might be some really good advice. I think that a lot of ground has been broken now in a few areas, and there's some really good examples now out there of permitting that's been done to address these types of projects. So we talked a little bit earlier about sizing rock. This is one of our main issues to overcome as we do this work. We mentioned the technical note that was put out by NRCS in the back of that document, and I'm sure somebody could get a link to that tech note if it hasn't already been posted. It's a really good resource, but in the back of that is an appendix there for this rock recipe. And so we specifically have worked with operators, gravel pit operators in the Gunnison Basin to create a specific size of rock that's really suitable for our needs. And so this is a little bit different than your general riprap that like a Wyoming DOT would use or something, because they're typically, they want to put their stuff in with hydraulics, and all of our stuff is generally hand built. And so, 10 to 18 inches is sort of, these rocks on the bigger side. This stuff's a little smaller. This is generally a little smaller, but in general, this type of rocks mix, the majority being between 6 and 12, some of it being 12 to 18, and then some small stuff for fitting in is a really good mix. We talked a little bit about how you do that. I think it does depend on the size of the channel and the amount of water that you might anticipate. Sometimes you want to be a little bit bigger. Specific structures may need to have a bunch of bigger rock and not really a bunch of little rock. And so, so staging then becomes important too. So you have the right size rock where you need it. One of the first things that had really attracted me to Bill's techniques was this idea about using on-site materials. So using native rock or native wood in the area. I think we should always look to that stuff first. This is a group of us going up the road in Susanville, California, around that area. We're headed to the project site. And when they built this road, there's all this leftover rubble that they just, graded off to the side. And so we took the opportunity to just load up all our trucks on our way to the work site and take advantage of all this stuff. I can tell you here that this guy right here, archaeologist, that guy right there, archaeologist, this was the field office manager, actually, but we cleared all this stuff and had a pretty good discussion about cultural resource stuff before we started pillaging rock off the landscape. And so I would say that with the use of native rock, maybe there's cultural resource concerns. Sometimes there's wildlife concerns with harvesting native rock. And so just be aware of some of that stuff and be sensitive to those types of ideas. It does take quite a bit of time to gather native rock. This went really quickly because it's all just right here along the side of the road. If you're having to root across the landscape in some sagebrush systems and try and, find a rock, bring it back to your work site, go out, find another rock, bring it back to your work site. Sometimes that can take a lot of time. And so that's just another something to consider with native rock. So imported rock, generally, you can get a lot of rock delivered. Rock is actually fairly cheap. Getting it where you need it, might be a little bit more expensive and probably some of the major costs of these projects. But other concerns about, not importing a bunch of weird noxious weeds into your project area, is a concern with importing material. But those are just some considerations when we think about native versus imported rock. So getting back to material delivery and access constraints, we've used loaders some. So you see these two loaders, one's got a 4-yard bucket and one's got a 3-yard bucket. So they can pack quite a bit of material at a time, which is handy. We develop access staging maps so we can clear areas. You can see there's an old road here, and I made this map just for specific dump spots for the loader operator. We designed something in this reach. We knew how much rock we needed at each individual location, 5 to 5.5 yards right here, 3.5 yards up here. And so those loader operators could, we had this staked, they could follow along, dump what we needed, where we needed it, and move on. Also, this is maybe one of our fancier delivery methods. This is the Forest Service mule pack string that we were able to use. And we got into some really remote sites that we had been lusting after for years, but we could never get any material to them. And so we were able to utilize this pack string and load a bunch of rocks up, go to the top, dump them, and they made a bunch of trips. Kind of another innovative method for getting material where you need it. I can tell you that we've hauled a lot of material in the back of a UTV. And when we started this project, and I looked at a pile of 65 yards of rock and thought we're moving all that with a bunch of UTVs, I thought it was pretty crazy. But, we get a bunch of hands together. So we use groups and filling them up, motoring them into where we need them. Maybe we don't use the same route every time. We spread it out. But it's really about being creative. What do you have? I know in Lander, I think we were able to use a tractor from the Fish and Game. Over in Sublette County, we're going to have a loader deliver the rock where we need it. ATVs with trailers rock litters, rock baths. We've used it all. But getting material where you need it is a major part of the project. And then really getting down to the implementation. Training your field crews is a really critical task, in proper construction technique. And also thinking about, safety. We don't really use hard hats anymore. This maybe was an early idea. But project safety, kids, we use a lot of kids or youth groups. There's something about a particular age, they just want to get on the pile. And typically, when kids are roaming around on top of the pile, that's a spot for them to get hurt. We go over project safety with tools, swinging a pickaxe, stuff like that, thinking about your neighbors. Sometimes, we get the volunteer crews together, whoever's doing the work, and we build a demonstration structure with everybody. And everybody gets to participate, watch, learn about proper construction technique. So training your field crews is important. I guess this idea too about training communities, and one of the things that I think we've learned while we've been doing this is that these projects take a team. It's tough. It's tough for one person to organize all of this work. And so, for example, this picture here was earlier this June down at that project at Wick on the Fish and Game ground down there. You see some red shirts here. These guys in the red shirts and gals in the red shirts, I met with them with Bill in 2019. The Fish and Game, all their habitat folks came to Siskiyou, and it was the entire state that came there. And I know Leah crashed it too. She was the one BLMer that showed up, but all of these folks are around the state now, and they've had a taste of some of this work. And so they can be really great partners. All of your NRCS local partners can be really great. The Soil Conservation Service, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife folks that are around the state. There's a few of them around, and they have large areas, but they're highly involved as well. And so developing your local community is really how these projects start to come together. You can start to build confidence, capacity. This is in California, Nevada, and this is in Washington State here. And then you build them. And this is the exciting part. You've done all this work, you've designed it, you got the rock where you need it. And finally, you get down to the nuts and bolts of really installing these particular structures, which is the fun part. We concentrate a lot on proper construction technique, talk about what we're doing. We work as a team. This is the fun part. And then a lot of pictures of, structures after they've been built. So that's it for project implementation. Brian, I think I'm going to stop sharing here and we'll move on to the next stage.
All right, thanks, Sean. Yeah, I think there were some great pictures there. Hopefully give some people some ideas how to actually get this work on the ground. Our next section is kind of the Wyoming project planning experience. Kind of have a pseudo roundtable discussion with some of the folks that have been involved in Leah's project and actually getting it permitted, getting it through federal NEPA, those types of things. And so with that, I guess I'm going to turn it over to Leah, Ben, and Sean to kind of lead that discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. As I mentioned, or just mentioned, these projects really take a team. And so I think what we wanted to do now was get some local perspective on this process about designing and implementing a project. And Leah at the BLM, like I said, she crashed that Fish and Game meeting in 2019. She was the only one not wearing a red shirt. And I think because she was really interested in these techniques and wanted to learn more about it. And so she was able to come and listen. And so I think what we maybe like to talk about is just her perspective on what she went through. And Lee, I know one of the things that I thought would be good is as you start to talk about this, but maybe just what were some of the biggest challenges that you had to overcome while you were doing this project?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for the intro. I think so. One of the things was just identifying the project area. We have lots of opportunities to improve riparian habitat on our field office, and wanted to try out some of these techniques. And so Deep Creek quickly came to the top of the list. The field office has, people that have been here for a long time have said, Deep Creek, it's an important area, and, it gets a lot of use. So it's been on our radar for a long time. And just to provide some background on the Deep Creek area, it is within the National Historic Trail corridor. So Oregon Trail, California Trail, Mormon Trail, all goes through there. And so there's a lot of historic impact from, livestock being taking that route out west. And then in addition to that, there's historic mining in the area. So there was a canal that was created and shuttled water out of the kind of the headwaters there. So we still see that impact on the landscape. And then currently, this area does have quite a bit of cattle use, and cattle management has improved over the last several years. There's a kind of a strange fence configuration that's in that drainage, and that keeps cattle kind of funneled into this area where the project is. So it gets quite a bit of use. And then also this is a really important area for wildlife. It's used for late brood rearing for sage grouse. Also, there's quite a few ungulates in there. Moose use this area. There's elk close by as well, and pronghorn, of course. And so this is a high priority area for conservation and certainly for wildlife. And so yeah, it was easy to identify that this is an area that we want to work on. And like Sean mentioned, it's definitely not too far gone. You can see some of the photos here of the project area. Sean sitting in this head cut where he's so excited to do this Zuni bowl. I think we all are, but you can see we're chatting about what to do at this spot. And so, yeah, as far as some of the challenges, I think one of the biggest things was really figuring out the issue with getting rock down into the site. So, of course, first we think, okay, well, can we grab, rock that's nearby? And, yeah, there is some rock nearby. But that issue or option was quickly crossed off the list because of cultural concerns, and there just wasn't enough rock. We walked this drainage a few times as a group, and then Sean came back, walked it several times himself, and we decided to do 20 structures, somewhere around 20 structures. And yeah, Sean calculated it out to be about 35 yards of rock. And that is just an enormous amount of rock. And so there was no way that we'd be able to harvest that much rock. So another option was going to this railroad bed that's fairly close, 45 minutes away about, which had perfect rock, super angular, blocky, a lot of different sizes. So we considered that. But that would mean driving trucks up there or trailers and putting it on manually and then driving that across a bumpy road, just not good for equipment. So we crossed that idea off the list too. And then quickly jumped to the idea of using the rock mine at South Pass. We were able to get 40 yards of rock for less than $2,000, super cheap. And our maintenance crew has a dump truck, a 10-yard dump truck. So they were able to take 4 loads and get it in there within a couple days. And they staged the rock fairly close to the drainage and in 4 different piles. The piles had, they were mixed rock sizes. And so they were staged there along the stretch that we wanted to treat. And then Game and Fish, they volunteered to take that rock and with their front end loader, substage that rock right next to the drainage where we're gonna do these structures, build these structures. So that takes care of like the planning as far as implementation. And we had to have all that planned out before going into the NEPA planning phase, because some of those things, I mean, moving the rock from the staging area to the sub-staging area, that there could potentially be issues there. We needed to think about, okay, well, getting that dump truck from South Pass to the project site, are there any issues there? And it turns out there was, because so this is right on the trails, as I mentioned, and we had an area that Jason, our maintenance guy, was concerned about taking a full loaded dump truck across these really pointy rocks along the trail. And we don't have an option of just, oh, well, we can just take out those pointy rocks, or, that's just not an option with that particular resource. So we had to go a different route, and then we had to put in some road base to make sure that we could get that dump truck across a few wet areas. So there was some prep that way. And then that kind of, so we had our proposed action. This is what we're going to do. This is our plan. And then, we go into our NEPA phase and make sure, analyze our issues. And like Sean mentioned, these projects have become more popular over the years. And so I think, early on, there's this idea that, it's problematic to work on BLM land because we have to do NEPA and that holds us up. And I guess, I guess I'll argue that it should never be an issue, or it should never be a problem to put together a NEPA document. That shouldn't be a hang up for these projects. I ended up leading an EA for this particular project because we did have one issue to analyze. That was a ladies' tresses issue. But other than that, there were no issues. So anyone in Wyoming could potentially do a DNA off of the EA that we did. Or I know that in our field office in future projects, we're probably going to go with a CX route, and that should be, a little bit more streamlined. And then there's also permitting, and Ben took care of that section.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. That was a great rundown. It's sort of a perfect capsule of everything we've been talking about. How to, we went out, we looked at a bunch of different sites. We settled on the one. We did a site analysis. You guys started identifying some issues. You have a historical cultural resource trail through that area that became something that had to be worked through. And then the design and getting the rock where you need it. Really typical. I do think, with this permitting, it's great that people like yourself and other people across Wyoming are cracking that nut, and that stuff can be tiered to or copied and pasted. That's a good way. But at any rate, so then Ben Vanilla, he had the really enviable task of addressing some of the permitting. on this project. And I can tell you, somebody like Ben in your cadre or in your group who understands this type of stuff is really invaluable. And so, Ben, I think we were hoping that maybe you could just run us through some of the stuff that you had to go through to help us prepare and permit for this project.
And real quick, Lee, are you still in witness protection, or would you mind turning on are you capable of turning on your camera?
Turning on my what?
Your camera. So
Oh,
tell that you're a real person.
I am, I swear.
Okay, thanks, Sean, for that. I think one of the biggest things I want to tell people out there when it comes to permitting is that early and often, as Jeremy and Sean both have alluded to, the sooner you can involve your regulators with the permitting process in this, the easier the process becomes for you down the road, because they feel like they have some buy-in and some input into how that worked. So that's one of the keys to this success, is reach out to them early and often. If you don't know, one of the great things is they will do a informal consultation with you to walk through some of your project, answer some of your questions before you actually submit your paperwork and have to go through that. So that that was a really valuable lesson that I learned off of this one, was that pre-consultation with state agencies as well as federal agencies was very helpful, so that when I turned in a package, the package was actually approved within a month by going through the pre-consultation and getting that stuff together. As Leah knows, I was very much pestering her and others. If you can get a design, we've finally got them to kind of commit to a certain level, at least in Wyoming. I don't know how it is in other states, but if you can have a conceptual together that's pretty much like in engineering terms, about the 60% design level, you can go all the way through on your permits with that. So you don't have to have your spots 100% nailed down, but you need to have it close enough that when we turn the paperwork in, we can have yardage placements, because that feeds into your permits as to if you can do a nationwide or things like that. So those are some of the key points I think I wanted to share with everybody. I know we're pushing our time, so I'll leave it with that.
Hey, Ben, tell us who some of those key regulators were in Wyoming specifically that you worked with.
Oh, sorry. Specifically, it was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Wyoming DEQ. We had to have buy-in from Wyoming Game and Fish. This particular project was considered Class 1 waters, which means we were in a consultation automatically. Any headwaters in most states are considered pristine, and it kicks you into a full consultation where you can't just get an exemption or a nationwide without having that. And then one of the other key ones that seems to take a while and is very disjunct still in Wyoming is state engineers for water rights purposes.
Great, thanks. And I can't emphasize enough what you said about that pre-consultation, pre-permitting phase. There's a lot of things that could be cleared up pretty early on. In fact, some of the regulators will even make a jurisdictional determination like, hey, that place you're working isn't actually a wetland that we regulate. And so, you can get that information before you ever fill out the paperwork, and they have a better idea of what you're up to as well, and which will help down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't go through a bunch of regulation and permitting if you don't have to. Let them tell you what you need and attack it accordingly. And yeah, I think I heard Leah offer to do NEPA for every field office in Wyoming. So I think you guys should be all good. Let's get some of this done.
Yeah, I wanted to add, this just lastly, I guess, this example at Deep Creek is part of that community training process that Sean mentioned, where, we were pre-COVID, our model has been to go to communities, and this content we're giving you today is stuff we would do in a classroom with 30 people or something, right? And then we'd spend the next few days building structures together and planning and laying it out. That, to me, I'm a hands-on learner. Like, all of this is academic until I start moving things around. And so I bet you're going to be in the same boat. You'll digest some of this, but know that in Wyoming, there are multiple projects like this happening where you could actually go see the projects. Some of them may have work days that you could engage in down the road. And so the whole goal with this is a demonstration, like to have a place where local partners can come see and touch and feel. So it's not as kind of this scary thing, but like, yeah, we could do this. And so I would encourage you to reach out to the others in this group, the others on the list. We've got, like, I saw Melanie Purcell up there from Sublette County Conservation District. You know, they've got a hands-on workshop coming up. There's going to be opportunities around the state to go see some of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think to that end, I mean, I think as Ben and others have mentioned, you know, the regulators are learning about this stuff too and trying to figure out where it fits into their workload and permitting and everything else. So the more we get out there, the more familiar they become, and hopefully the more successful they are, they become more and more comfortable with them and permitting them accordingly. So with that, I guess we'll hit a few questions before we move into the last module. I guess tied to that project location and selecting project locations, I guess, is it possible to cause resource damage if we pick the wrong place to work? And I mean, how much in that analysis do we really need before we say, yeah, we can do a project here without really screwing things up?
I know what you're going to say. Go ahead, Jeremy. You got this. You bet.
Well, you know, I come from a very risk-averse agency. I'm a career-long NRCSer, and we work with other people's property. So I will say it's justified. We're very concerned about not doing damage. Here's what I've seen on dozens of project sites, hundreds of structures. You know, most of the places we're working, it's not in the middle of high-dollar crop ground or in cities where infrastructure can be lost. We're talking about rangelands, forest lands, pretty rural areas where and low risk situations like those, you know, small gullies, small head cuts, you can't really do a lot of damage if something goes wrong. So I'd say take the fear factor out of it a little bit, do your homework and do the planning, put yourself in low risk situations, and you shouldn't have as much concern about a quote failure being, you know, a mar on your reputation out there.
Absolutely.
Another question, I guess, kind of coming back to BDAs a little bit, Jeremy, is I guess there was a question about whether these low-tech beaver mimicking techniques could be modified to actually work instead of rock or boulder structures. Again, the person asking the question, it says it seems more ecologically acceptable to use biodegradable material like wood than which would have been historically present. Right? Any thoughts there?
Well, certainly we can steal ideas from nature, and looking at what beavers do in terms of damming up water, slowing it down. You know, that post line wicker weave concept, those drawings that I showed you from the, you know, 400 years ago in France, you know, that's what that is. They're using those in gullies. And so my suggestion would be, if you do that, you're really not doing it to promote beaver activity. You're doing it in an erosion context, but you can also think about, you know, should I lower the height of that structure, right? Tall structures tend to impound a lot of water and then become a failure risk. But if you're low, you allow water to pass, you build it up in steps as that sediment gets trapped. That's the concept you'd want to kind of steal from both the Zeedyke world and some of the beaver world. Does that make sense?
Yep. What about fish passage and potential permit requirements related to that? I guess, or what kind of implementation requirements and considerations for for fish passage do you have to deal with? I assume they're mainly talking about with BDA stuff here.
Yeah, we won't spend a lot of time on that here because we're not focused on that perennial system, but that is a regulatory, another one on the list of things to do in coordination with your Fish and Game, sometimes Fish and Wildlife Service. So be conscientious of it, especially in your perennial streams.
And I would just add that, yeah, it's something you got to tackle, but, you know, I think in general, BDA structures tend to be fairly fish friendly. I mean, certainly it's species dependent, but I think it is a rule of thumb. All right, I guess we got time for probably one last question. If you don't have much rock in the area, what would be your suggestions? And then I guess kind of my personal follow up to that, since this is a safe zone, I guess, have any of you pillaged your neighbor's landscaping or anything else like that to accomplish these projects?
Oh, I've definitely been guilty of throwing some really nice footer rocks in the back of my truck at various locations. Maybe not in a residential neighborhood, but yeah, rock does seem to get in my truck every now and then. But it is an issue, you know, if you don't have materials to work with. And so we spend a lot of time trying to source local materials. I guess I would say, you know, each area has its own individual rock constraints. For example, you know, we're doing a project next week actually over in Pinedale with the group over there that Jeremy mentioned a little earlier. And, you know, there's a lot of round rock on the landscape over there. And so we went through a lot of discussions about, you know, is this round rock without any nice smooth edges suitable? You know, and I think in a lot of situations, you build stuff with what you can, you know, and utilizing whatever materials you have. It may not be the perfect structure, but as long as you're understanding what the concepts are and what the purpose of the structure is, you can use a lot of different stuff. And so I guess, you know, in a lot of sagebrush rangelands, there isn't a lot of rock around. So maybe finding, you know, a local quarry or a local gravel pit or some source like that where you could, as Leah mentioned, rock can be fairly cheap. It's just getting the rock where you need it, which is a little tougher. And so being creative with how you get it there is a good idea. But I would say, yeah, mostly it's about trying to use what you have, I guess.
Yeah, we've encountered this in a lot of different settings. We were out in South Dakota and eastern Montana where there's very little rock. But I have been shocked at how cheap rock is to move around. So quarries that are hours away could be trucked to your site for, in the term of restoration projects, fairly cheap. You know, when we're used to doing a meadow restoration that costs $50,000, you know, 5 to 10 grand on some rock and trucking doesn't sound like much to me. And so I guess I would encourage you, like Leah did, you know, take your spear and draw a big hoop and go, where could I get this from? And, you know, that is actually more doable than you might think.
All right, folks, it's 2:25. We're in the home stretch. Hopefully you can all sense it, getting fired up for some real work in the field or just the end of the day and a cold beverage of your choosing. Regardless, we'll get going to wrap this up for the day. I did have one question I meant to ask prior to break and I missed it. That maybe I think it ties in better with the last section or the previous section rather than the last one. And this be for Sean or Jeremy. The question is the general thought process to determine whether to use a Zuni bowl versus a rock rundown versus a rock mulch versus a one rock dam.
Yeah, I can take that one. It's a really good question, except for the one rock dam part. So thinking about each structure, what they do. Sorry, I've been asked to give me my video here. Yes, so when to employ those head cut control structures. So when to use a Zuni bowl, when to use a rock rundown, rock mulch. Basically in our world, it depends on the size of the head cut. So if the head cut's over about 2 feet high, you're going to want to try and do a Zuni bowl. So you have an opportunity to have that step balls falling off of that head cut. Especially if it's kind of a steeper head cut, like a vertical wall head cut, definitely a Zuni bowl. Rock rundowns, laybacks, those types of ideas. Maybe it's the size of the head cut, the height. So lesser, if there's smaller head cuts, small head cuts, we definitely use rock rundowns a lot for those particular circumstances, or rock mulch if it's off channel. And so I guess the answer to the question is really the size of the head cut is what dictates which particular head cut control structure you would use.
Yeah, and I did put a link to the tech note in there as well as a PDF, which we have a little table in there where we kind of summarize where to use those types of head cut control structures.
All right. Well, very good. So size does matter. That's what we learned. And so now it's on to the final stretch, monitoring and maintenance. And we'll turn it back over to Jeremy and Sean.
You bet. All right. So monitoring and maintenance, kind of our last step here. There's a couple different types of monitoring that we should talk about. The first one is this structure condition and performance monitoring. So how did your structure work? What does the structure look like? I guess this idea too about Z-dike techniques being designed to make gradual improvements through time is a really important one, because it's basically Bill's philosophy that that you work with water, you let the water do the work. And so if we try, his idea is to use a modest approach. That's why we don't build our structures all the way up to the top right away. We make incremental changes over time. So if you build a small structure, the water will say, well, okay, I'll work a little bit to go up over this thing. It'll drop its sediment in behind your one rock dam and go on down the valley. And over time, you can get that sediment aggradation in behind your structure. And then you can go ahead and start to think about building another layer. And I think us, particularly in our environment, our social environment right now, we love to just hit the easy button, put it in the microwave, hurry up, get it done. As Jeremy says, bring in a Tonka toy with some hydraulics and get this thing restored. That's definitely not Bill's idea. He's about making gradual improvements. And so these structures are meant to be monitored annually, maybe especially after the first runoff event, and then maybe for a couple years after that, to see how they're working, if it's working the way that you thought it was going to work, and then repair and modify as needed. So we go out the year after we've installed a structure. We kind of see, did the water go where we thought it was going to go? We like to see all this sediment being deposited after spring runoff. We don't mind if we have some grouse tracks going through our sediment. It's kind of fun. And I wanted to show a couple pictures and just highlight that this is really rare. We had a really big flood come through right after we built these structures in this particular drainage. And, a couple rocks here, you can see this is a one rock dam, a former one rock dam, and all this stuff got sheared off and was carried downstream a little bit. Similarly, we had a pretty good head cut right here as we were going to channel, and this was a relatively poorly made structure, and it all sort of ended up right down in here. And so I can tell you in the 10 years that I've been doing this work, this is the only occasion, this particular runoff event, where we had some damage like this in our structure. And so I guess the other thing, you know, going back to low risk, this isn't a big deal for us, you know. I mean, we're working with a complex of structures. You can see there's another one rock dam up here. There's one here. There's another one just down below. Nothing really happened super bad because this structure failed here, you know. And we learned that this particular corner it was not only going to a channelized effect, but it was on this corner. And we learned that the structure, the way it had been built, wasn't going to survive. And so we learn a lot from structure maintenance. Typically, it's maybe one or two rocks maybe that have fallen out here or there potentially. And then, you know, after a couple of years, all the vegetation grows up through these things and they become really resilient. And you don't have to do hardly any maintenance to them. So another type of monitoring is about, you know, are there additional interventions that are needed? So for example, this is a one rock dam that we talked about earlier. There used to be a big channel through here. This one rock dam has now filled all of this basin with sediment now. And so all the sediment is up to the top of the structure here. And the nice thing about Bill's approach is that now this structure right here is ready for a second layer. So you can build another one rock dam on top of this and go ahead and bring it up another foot, integrate another layer of sediment a foot deep. And pretty soon, you know, if you have a lot of sediment coming down the valley, you can degrade systems fairly quickly in this fashion. Now, if we'd have come up, you know, 2 or 3 feet all at once, and then that water came around the corner and hit a 2.5 foot tall wall, it probably would have not wanted to go up and over it. It would have tried to end cut around each side and we would have had structure failure. And so this is the beauty of Bill's incremental approach. And it's tough because, like I said, as Americans, we like to hit the easy button and have it done right away. But this is really Bill's approach. It's working with the water to make this stuff happen. Here's an example of a second layer. You can see there was an old either rock rundown or one rock dam in the bottom here. It all filled in and we were able to come back then, put another layer on top, and all of a sudden, you can't see it in this picture, but we've got floodplain access on Valley Left here. So when we get big flows, it flows out onto the floodplain again, instead of just running down this incised gully. So monitoring structure performance, what's the next step? Obviously, depending on your project, you've got specific goals related to your project. We call this outcome-based monitoring. So in the Gunnison Basin, this gal, Renee Rondeau, she works for the Heritage Program here. She's a botanist ecologist. She was the first one in our project that really started monitoring the vegetation response as a result of our treatments. And so we used vegetation response as a surrogate for whether we were being successful, you know. And so again, our project goal was to increase resilience, and we wanted to increase wetland forbs, wetland cover, and decrease upland species. And so monitoring vegetation with this line point intercept method, really detailed, takes some time, but over the years, it can give you a really good idea about what's changing vegetatively about as a result of your treatments. And she had controls, and it was pretty rigorous study. And she's got a great data set now from our work there. Another type of monitoring that you can do to see if your projects are working is photo points. And so photo points are a really nice method to easily get repeatable photos taken from exactly the same spot, hopefully at exactly the same time of your treatment area. And photos are a great way to easily diagram and represent changes over time. And so we put in this media luna. it spread water out over this whole meadow here. And then you see the years and the response that we've got just from reestablishing sheep flow as a result of that one Media Luna treatment. So photo points are a really good economical way to document change over time. You know, recently we've been trying to get more into soil moisture monitoring. This is Andrew Brebart. He's the hydrologist in the Gunnison Basin who's been part of this project from the beginning. He's got a number of different techniques going, piezometers and soil moisture sensors. We've got student from the local university doing a master's project on this. So some really good stuff coming out of this, ways that you can monitor treatment results as a result of your projects. One of my favorite methods is camera traps. So remotely triggered cameras. Nate Seward with Colorado Parks and Wildlife has been doing a lot of this, monitoring our treated areas and control areas. He also has a student working with him to analyze the bazillion photos that are generated from a project like this. But this can be another way. You know, it's hard to really show grouse usage. You can do pellet counts or some other stuff, but it's hard to show, you know, that possibly we're having a real effect on late brood rearing habitat. And so this is one way where maybe you could get at some of the wildlife effects as you go along. And so these are just some more outcome-based monitoring methods. I think monitoring is a really good idea, you know, to try and answer the question, you know, are we having effect, and what effect might we be having from as a result of these treatments? Jeremy, if
Right
you
on.
got this, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So kind of closing out the outcome-based monitoring options, we have a lot of tools at our fingertips that are free and easy to access from your desktop now, just an explosion of technology. And recall that study that we did early on looking at low-tech restoration around the West and kind of taking a look at resiliency through the lens of satellite vegetation data and that productivity. Well, we actually have a map layer on our Sagegrass Initiative map site here called our Mesic Resources layer. And it basically depicts those, you know, valley bottom areas as well as higher elevation kind of mountaintops, things that stay productive late in the summer. And the colors you see represented there are essentially productivity indices and how often those areas are, quote, productive and available for late season use. So if they're green, they're productive almost all the time, every year over that 35 plus year history. The red and orange, you know, are things that may get wet some years, but other years they dry up. And you can use that to evaluate projects, especially projects that are a little bit bigger, not the micro sites. But Sean, hit the next. Here's an example. This is kind of a traditional Tonka toy project, but one that was available to me right here in my backyard, Central Oregon. Took an incised stream, put it back up on a floodplain and re-wetted that up. And then we ran it through our Mesic Resources layer and hit next. And you get an output that looks like this, where it basically maps that productivity through time. And what you see here is that before the project, they were in kind of that dry, you know, level of production. If you weren't out there, it looked a lot like an upland, like dryland grasses and stuff. After the project was implemented, we see that productivity bounce up, and it has stayed up ever since they've implemented that. And so, you know, the picture on the top is what it looks like today. And you can see those green groceries that are now available to deer, elk, livestock, whatever you care about there, fish. This was done for steelhead. Those are things that we like to say, if you can measure a response from space, you must be doing something right. This is a blunt instrument that we can use to help tell our story, whether that's to funders or whoever else you need to justify your project results to. Hit next. And another new tool in our toolbox here, the rangeland analysis platform, massive breakthroughs in our ability to map vegetation on the Earth's surface in the last few years. Specifically on this site, we've got functional group vegetation cover every year from 1984 to present. And that's at a 30-meter resolution. So think inside of a baseball diamond is about the size of a 30-meter pixel. So if you have a meadow you're working in that's about that size, these types of satellite-derived maps can be really important for helping tell your story. So next slide. One brand new product last year was herbaceous production, both in the form of perennial grasses and forbs and annual grasses and forbs. This, for the first time, we can start to see pounds per acre of herbaceous production or forage, if that's how you want to look at the world. And we have this data, every year for over 30 years, and we have it every 16 days. And so you're able to kind of track throughout a growing season how productivity is changing, perhaps in response to your management. And you can just hit the last slide here, Sean. This is that same project example run through the RAP biomass. And you can see the same type of response on the graph where, when we implemented that project, we see basically a doubling of herbaceous production on that valley bottom after. And so a really simple tool you can use in your reporting, in your tracking, just along the lines of, demonstrating that efficacy in a way that makes sense to average folks. Like, what does this really mean? Don't tell me about numbers of structures and feet of this and acres of that. What does it really mean? And this can link back to more grass, more forbs, more wetland plants, more production, more bugs, more resiliency, which is kind of that shared vision we started with. And so with that, Sean, I think we're all wrapped up here and we're ready to kick it back over to Brian to just close us out.
Well, very good. I guess I got a couple quick questions for you gentlemen, and then I'll hit my actual formal wrap up. And if we get any other questions in the interim, I'll bring those up as well. I guess one question is tied to what type of livestock management would you like to see in place following your work? Is there any sort of prescription you would like to see? And then if you can't get that, I mean, what's the best options there?
I guess I can speak to that a little bit just based on some of our experience in Gunnison. Ranching is extremely important in Gunnison, and we did go into this project with the idea that we were going to do our work and not ask anybody to change their management practices. And we pretty much stuck to that. I think that over time, there has been some folks, some producers who have noticed changes on their property that we've worked on. There was one particular rancher, in fact, who he would just leave like a few head in this valley bottom all summer long, and he didn't really realize that just 10 head in there all summer walking up and down that valley bottom were really having an effect on the production of that area. And so, but I think what we've done really is we want these things to be compatible with grazed rangelands. And so we've actually modified our structure types and maybe size, like I mentioned earlier, based on some of the impacts that we saw. So if livestock want to walk right next to the structure, they don't like to walk on rocks. And so we've learned to bring those structures up out of the channel a little bit, and then we don't get those impacts. And so we've actually changed our practices a little bit in response to those effects. Jeremy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think about our project in Susanville with the BLM out there, and they've got a feral horse problem. And, they asked the question, is it worth doing this if we can't control wild horses? And I asked Bill Zedike about it because I wasn't sure. And before I could complete my sentence, he said yes. And, in his view, water in the desert is precious. So even if it's not perfect, and if you can get that hydrology functioning, you set the table for opportunities for other things. And so I would agree with that it may not be the highest functioning thing you've ever built, but it's much better than it's been. And if we can work with a producer to talk about time and timing of grazing, which, really is what it's about. It's like making sure they're not in there all season long during the times when our wetland plants are really vulnerable to that degradation. So, we're not huge fans of exclosures. It just leaves a pile of maintenance mess around the landscape. So, pastures that you can manage and get them out of there at certain times of the year are probably more feasible. And we've seen great additive effects of doing the structures and the grazing management together.
That's great. I think that was the last formal question. If I happen to come across any that didn't get answered by accident, we'll try to respond to those directly, I guess, if we dig those up. I guess without further ado, I'll jump into the kind of formal wrap up then, if I can make this thing work. All right, can folks see my screen?
Yep.
All right, perfect. Well, I think we kind of spilled the beans on lots of this stuff already, but I just wanted to provide another overview of some resources and reference material you guys will have access to, or do have access to, for future reference and future projects and development and those types of things. Jeremy showed lots of this stuff. There's some great resources out there on a couple of these websites there for BDA, process-based restoration things. He already shared some of the tech notes that we've put out as an agency, and this erosion control field guide, which I guess is in short supply. So you'll have to print it off, and unfortunately the hardbound version is tough to come by these days, but maybe that'll change in the future as well. I don't know about the availability of Bill's actual book. I assume you can get it at some of your favorite bookstores. Yeah, Jeremy went over this. We were fortunate enough here in Wyoming a few years ago to actually host this workshop near Lander again. There seems to be a theme there, but given COVID, they went virtual last year. And so now all those modules are available to anybody that wants to sit through them. And again, some great resources out of Utah State to get you started on the BDA path and PALS path and those types of things. And again, just some really great background information on the how, why, those types of things that are certainly worth looking into. Not to mention, I'm a pretty big fan of the symbol they chose to use there. As far as this actual workshop, there's been a lot of questions in this chat related to that. I mentioned earlier today that it is being recorded. It has been recorded. And then Hannah, our benevolent Zoom overlord, will be going through that in the next few days, cropping that up and cutting it into sections, and then hopes to have that available for public distribution in about a week. So if folks missed it, they should have an opportunity to catch it, and hopefully that'll be helpful for other people. And then yes, there was just a question about people wanting the presentations. We will make those available in PDF version in the future as well. And Hannah will provide direction to all that for all of us. Other things to be keeping in mind, we didn't talk about much today, but certainly funding is always an issue. you know, we talked a lot about these being relatively inexpensive projects, but they still aren't free. And so there are funding sources available. You know, certainly I represent the NRCS and the Farm Bills. But we have practices to carry out these projects. We're kind of in our infancy and actually getting those rolled out, but we are doing some of that work, as you heard earlier. Other federal agencies certainly have some funding that may be able to be applied to these projects as well. You heard it from Mark Hogan on kind of what are his shops, you know, starting to dabble in this work too. He's got some funding available. Federal land agencies do. NFWF, National Fish Wildlife Foundation, they've been a pretty big funder of this type of work and these types of workshops going currently. A big supporter of that, and so there might be a funding opportunity there. We mentioned that Game and Fish has been kind of some of the first in the door on a lot of this work in Wyoming. And so I think they're certainly interested in additional work going forward. So might be a good partner for your project. WWNRT, great funding source in Wyoming. I haven't specifically talked to Bob Budd about these, but I'm sure he'd be interested in them. And so certainly other NGOs, we mentioned TNC's been an early adopter of much of this work, continues to do more of it. And there's plenty of other TU, DU, they've all been involved. So lots of the Unlimited Forevers, those types of groups might be good partners to look into. And certainly your local conservation districts are always a great partner for working with private landowners. So just, I think keep your options open. There's lots of them available. You know, labor sources. To me, this is kind of where we really need to build this out, in my opinion, in Wyoming. I don't condone child labor, but I know Jeremy has said that if you go on a vacation with him, you might get tasked with building some of these regardless of age. So we talked about lots of different options, you know, and Sean showed, you know, this, and that's what this Deep Creek project is kind of a community building thing. But I think long term, we do need to get more contractors involved, those types of people that can do this at scale. Conservation corps in other states I know are very active in this arena. But yeah, I think the options are endless again, and we just need to kind of pursue all avenues as best we can to be able to really scale this up and get it done. Again, these don't take a lot of time, they don't take a lot of effort, but they do take a fair amount of planning, and they do take physical labor. So we got to get people that are interested in doing that. As far as contacts, here's all your presenters' email addresses. That's probably the best way to get a hold of most of us. Certainly, if you're interested, we can provide you phone numbers, other contact information, but this would be a great way to get a hold of us initially. And yeah, feel free to provide us additional questions as you work through this. And if there's ways we can help get your project off the ground, we'd love to hear from you. And that's it. Again, at the end of the day, now it's time to roll up our sleeves and get some of this work done. Help each other do that as much as possible, and try to get at that real landscape effect. With that, I'd just like to thank you all for your time today, and taking the time out of the middle of field season to sit through a workshop with you. I really hope you got something out of it, and don't be a stranger. Feel free to reach out with questions, comments, etc. Thank you very much, and have a great day, and have a great rest of your field season.